You can go ahead and start, Marvin.
Welcome to the Middle East Institute's webinar discussion focused today on a question of whether a transitional government offers the last path to peace in Afghanistan. We have a stellar panel to discuss the issues raised by this and related questions. Our program is co-sponsored by Indus, a Pakistani diaspora think tank based in Washington, D.C., and dedicated to a better understanding of U.S.-Pakistan relations and their interest in people-to-people contacts, community integration, and youth leadership development in Pakistan. The first hour or so of our program will consist of a set of questions I will pose to our panelists. Following this, I'll try to field as many of your questions as time permits. To submit questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on live stream, you can ask questions by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have technical issues, please also use events@mei.edu. Feel free to write your questions at any time during the course of our program. With intra-Afghan talks in Doha stalled and a U.S. troop withdrawal still scheduled to be completed by May 1st, 2021 brought new initiatives intended to inject life into the Afghan peace process. In late January, there appeared in Kabul a draft proposal for an interim government. It featured institutional power sharing for 90 days that would allow for the completion of a constitution. It had many of the hallmarks, though, of a proposal designed to create a path to a Taliban-dominated government. The document was thought to have Taliban authorship, but also possibly discreet endorsement of the United States. What soon followed was, in early March, the U.S. presented its own power-sharing transitional government plan. What followed was a leaked tough love letter from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. The letter suggested steps toward the implementation of the American proposal, most notably a call for the convening of an April conference in Turkey, bringing together those countries believed to have major stake in the future of Afghanistan. The meeting was conceived as a setting the stage for fresh talks, presumably influenced by the US proposal, between Taliban delegates and those representing the Republic. It's to get a fuller understanding of these developments that we now turn to our panel. Javed Ahmed is the ambassador of Afghanistan to the United Arab Emirates. He also serves as a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Javed has for several years been a senior advisor to the Afghan government, focusing on counterterrorism, anti-money laundering, and anti-terrorism financing. Ahmed Rashid is a highly esteemed Pakistani journalist and author of 5 books, including the widely acclaimed Taliban and Descent into Chaos. Ahmed has combined his writing and investigative reporting with involvement in human rights movements and peace building in Afghanistan. He's been covering the wars in Afghanistan, conflicts in Central Asia, and Pakistan foreign policy since 1979. Lisa Curtis is currently a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, where her work focuses on US-India strategic relations, China's role in the region, and counterterrorism strategy in South and Central Asia. A foreign policy and national security expert with over 2 decades of service in government, Lisa has previously served on the National Security Council, in the State Department and CIA, and on Capitol Hill. William Malley is an emeritus professor at the Australian National University. His areas of expertise include international relations, political theory, and refugee migration. Bill has authored several outstanding books on Afghanistan. He's highly regarded in government and academic circles in Australia and internationally for his publications on diplomacy, peace building, and reconstruction. With Afghanistan as the center point of Bill's scholarship, he's especially admired for his social science erudition and his encyclopedic knowledge. And I'm Marvin Weinbaum, Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute, former State Department intelligence analyst, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So now to our panel and our questions. Let me start with a question which perhaps is all too obvious now, and I think will serve as a good springboard for our full discussion. Does the US proposal for an interim government represent a bold step to secure peace or an unrealistic last-ditch effort to salvage negotiations? So, who'd like to start us off? William, why don't you do that?
Why don't I kick off? Marvin, I think it's something different again. I think at one level it's unrealistic if we see it as a proposal to secure peace, but it does fit into a wider pattern of diplomacy in recent times having been focused on an exit strategy for the United States rather than the wider issue of how to promote stability within Afghanistan. I think the great advantage that it has from the point of view of the Biden administration is that it puts off, albeit perhaps only briefly, the hard choice of whether to stay or go, which is something which, of course, was left in the lap of the Biden administration by the way in which the process was managed by the Trump administration, and specifically Dr. Khalilzad as the Trump administration's envoy. But in a sense, it's a very unpleasant decision for an American president to have to make. So any kind of tactical approach that can defer the making of such a decision by smothering it in some other kind of activity may seem attractive. But of course, it's not a recipe for solving a deep-rooted, complex problem of the kind that Afghanistan presents. And the notion that a conference in April in Istanbul is going to be able to solve the problems of political order in Afghanistan is wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety.
Well, Bill, let me just stop you on that. The conference, is it anything more than getting nations on board with encouraging that they reach an agreement? But the real negotiation would take place, would it not, among the Afghans themselves, the intra-Afghan meeting. So the one is only, is it not right to say an introduction to or a setting the stage, as I said, for the intra-Afghan talks?
Well, I don't know that one can detach the two as sharply as that, partly because a critical factor in the ability of the Taliban to wreak havoc within Afghanistan has been the sanctuaries in Pakistan from which they've operated, and the continued access that they enjoy to such sanctuaries is critical to their capacity to play a role in Afghanistan. They're a player in Afghanistan not because they're wildly popular, but because they can act as a spoiler to any kind of stability within the country. So it's not possible simply to compartmentalize internal discussions between the Afghans and separate them from the wider framework of support that the Taliban have been receiving for a very considerable period of time now. But beyond that, I think it's also the case that when you have such deep-rooted rifts between the parties as exist in Afghanistan, the notion that you can simply overcome them through a little bit of pressure from outside players is delusional. That we've seen examples in the past, for example, the Paris Accords on Cambodia in 1991, when the Khmer Rouge were, in a sense, elbowed into signing the agreement by Chinese pressure, but they immediately began looking for ways in which they could detach themselves from the commitments that they had nominally made to the peace process, and that created all sorts of implementation challenges for the UN when it became involved on the ground with the UNTAC mission. And I suspect that the challenges in Afghanistan would be infinitely greater even than those that existed in the Cambodian case.
Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Marv, and thanks for organizing this. I couldn't agree more with Ambassador Malley's comments. I think I might just be a bit more blunt. I think that this 8-page peace plan that was leaked in the press a few weeks ago is an unrealistic last-ditch effort, as you have asked in the question. And I'll explain why. I don't think there's any chance that the Taliban is going to agree to a comprehensive ceasefire by May 1st. That's less than a month from now. And unless the Taliban do commit to a ceasefire, I think if you remove the democratically elected government in favor of this interim arrangement, you're going to only assist the Taliban in what it's trying to do. It's trying to delegitimize the government. And you're making it easier for the Taliban to take over the state militarily. So I think that's my fear, is that, you know, just kind of throwing this peace plan out there would not be such a bad thing if it was just a way to get the parties to keep talking. You know, if it was a way to buy time for the US to keep troops there and keep the two sides talking. That's not in and of itself a bad thing. What I fear, though, is that because it's easier to put pressure on the Afghan government rather than the Taliban, that you'll see this pattern that we've seen repeatedly over the last couple of years of the US negotiator, when times get tough, making the Afghan government make the concessions, because that's just easier to do than getting the Taliban to make concessions. And what happens is it ends up being a lopsided peace process. In a way, you're rather than establishing the terms of a genuine peace process, you're actually helping the Taliban achieve its objectives at the expense of the Afghan state. So I think that's my underlying fear. But I also note it's quite chaotic right now, because you not only have this 8-page peace plan that's been released to the media, you have President Ghani presenting his own peace plan. And then I'm not even sure that the Taliban has committed to attending these talks in Turkey. So there's still a lot of moving pieces right now. And I have to admit, I'm not very optimistic.
Ahmed.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything that's been said, including Lisa's very blunt comments. The fact is that, you know, 1 year, I mean, these talks have been going on for more than a year now, and 1 year down the road, we still have no idea what kind of government the Taliban want. Do they want a constitution? Do they want an interim government? What will they do about the security forces? A whole host of questions that, frankly, the Americans have not been able to access any reply for from the Taliban over all this time. And that really, I mean, in my opinion, there were two critical issues which should have been focused on. One was the ceasefire, and the other was the intra-Afghan dialogue. And I don't think the Trump administration really even tried to address the question of inter-Afghan dialogue. And, you know, basically, I think many Afghans feel that the Americans have just given away far too much without exerting the leverage that they had at the beginning of this process. And they did have leverage. The fact is that, you know, the Taliban want the Americans to leave. And the Americans said, we'll leave if you do, you know, accept certain conditions. And unfortunately, that leverage has been whittled away to almost nothing now. And it's very difficult to see how the Taliban are going to respond, except to offer a blanket denial on everything. And of course, as you said earlier, I mean, the Ghani government has been blamed for a lot of things. And yes, its performance has been pretty hopeless in the terms of bringing together all the Afghan grouplets and the warlords and the politicians onto a common platform. But they've been constantly undermined. I mean, the freeing of 5,000 prisoners, which the Americans forced Ghani to do last year, and other such instances have, undermined the Afghan president in the eyes of his own people. Well, that's a very difficult question. How do you correct that? And it may be too late now to correct that.
Javed?
Well, thank you, Marvin, and it's very good to be here. I would fully echo whatever has been said by my fellow speakers. I think in some ways the draft U.S. proposal is a cry for help, but in other ways it's also an effort, essentially an effort to acknowledge that the Doha talks have faltered spectacularly, if not failed altogether, because it hasn't yielded the results that were intended or desired. And so the US proposal right now is aimed at finding a creative alternative approach to basically pursue the objectives of Doha. Now, on the proposal itself, we have to look at the merits of it and see which part of the proposal is actually practical and which are mere fantasy or simply imaginary. Now, first, on the idea of the interim government itself, I would say anyone who is talking about the interim setups or interim governments are the ones who are undermining the prospects of actual true peace or just peace in Afghanistan. And that's because transitional governments generally come at a later stage of once a peace agreement is established and a peace agreement is enforced across the board, and not at the start of it. So, while I don't see the Taliban necessarily as peacemakers, mainly because they've never sued for peace, but in this particular case, I would argue that even though even the Taliban have rejected the idea of such an interim setup, and they seem to have a point this time. Now, the bigger problem with interim government is that the actual uncertain nature of such governments, because there's a great deal of unpredictability attached to it. So it's not just about forming such governments, it's about ensuring that it succeeds. And how could you actually ensure a successful interim government if the Taliban refuse to be part of it, for example, which are party to the conflict or the main party to the conflict? Now, assume there is an interim government, for example. If it fails without the right military or political contingencies in place, mainly from the United States, then the situation on the ground is going to be worse. So in my view, the interim government is not just an imaginary idea as a concession to the Taliban, and this is a major concession to the Taliban, but also their state level patrons and supporters who have issues with the principal position that the Afghan government in this case have taken with respect to Afghanistan peace. And this is also a concession because they want to use this to essentially paint the Afghan government as anti-peace when they question it. So President Ghani has presented a counter proposal that focuses on three elements, and that's making peace, building peace, and sustaining peace, with of course with a principal focus on transitioning power through early elections. The problem right now is Taliban have said, and they believe that elections are bad in Afghanistan, or at least carries a bad reputation in Afghanistan, and they have rejected it. So instead, they want religious clerics to develop a method for establishing a future system. So in other words, Taliban don't care for elections, no matter how vigorously it's monitored by entities like the United Nations or even EU. And instead, they favor a decadent views of someone from the Haqqani madrasas to come in and then form a system. So I expect, and this is my personal view, that there will likely be a deadlock in Turkey conference if the conference happens.
It seems very unlikely that there will be American full withdrawal. We have about 3,500 troops in the country. And of course, there are several thousand contractors who also have to be evacuated if our troops leave. It seems unlikely for logistical reasons. Certainly, any idea of disposing of the equipment, whether left behind, destroyed, or taken, would take far more time to arrange than we now have. So if that's the case, what are we looking at now? The US won't be out as is specified by the February 29th, 2020 agreement. What now will follow if that's the case? We hear that there are ongoing discussions about getting an extension. What's involved in this, and what would the trade-off be? Bill.
Let me kick off. I've found this whole debate a somewhat mystifying one, because given that there was a firm timetable to which the United States committed in the 29th February 2020 agreement for the complete withdrawal of US forces and contractors, it's never been clear to me why the Taliban would be remotely interested in agreeing to any kind of extension at this particular point. The kinds of incentives that have been mooted as potential devices for procuring such consent have never struck me as particularly persuasive. The notion that more prisoners could be released, well, I think that would go down like a lead balloon with the Afghan government. But putting that aside, the Taliban may well calculate that if their objective is to take over Afghanistan totally anyway, they will be able to liberate their own prisoners at some point in the future. And they may well equally have calculated that once the United States is gone altogether and Afghanistan had dropped off the radar, the interest internationally in maintaining a rigorous sanctions regime against existing Taliban figures will probably dissipate. And it's worth remembering that when the Taliban took over Kabul in 1996, the initial response of people in the State Department was far from perturbed by what had happened. And indeed, the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia remarked that the United States had no difficulty with the Taliban in terms of their legitimacy or lack thereof. And it was only the massive publicity that was given to the Taliban's treatment of women just months out from a presidential election in the United States that actually swung things around there. But I wouldn't be at all confident that post substantial completion of a US withdrawal from Afghanistan, an administration in Washington would be particularly forthright in holding the line on a whole range of other elements that might be under discussion at the moment. And that both makes the Afghan government skeptical about making concessions, and it makes the Taliban skeptical about whether they would gain much from concessions.
So what are we looking at then over this next 6 weeks or so? And assuming the United States is still there, along with allied forces who seem to be in lockstep with the United States as far as their decision on withdrawal, does this mean the end of the peace process at that point? After all, can it be argued that what the Taliban are most interested in is, after all, that foreign forces leave? So is it possible that once they have seen that they can't get them to leave on the expected date, that it may be worth their while to string this out a bit and to accept 3 months, for example, which is what the US is apparently proposing to the Taliban? After all, that's not very far. And what can 3 months accomplish? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, Marvin, the point is, you raised the right question right at the end. What can the 3 months accomplish? And I think what we will see is the Taliban will accept an extension. They'll go along with it, 3 months, 6 months, something like that. They'll go along with the Biden administration. but is that time period going to be used productively to end up with a game plan for the future state of Afghanistan? And frankly, I don't think so. I think what the Americans have demonstrated to the Taliban is that we are we are a losing wicket, and we've done enough for you. We will continue to try and bring you into a peace process and an interim government. And of course, the Taliban are going to reject any such efforts.
Well, if I may, not only would it probably not be productive, the question is, what pound of flesh are the Taliban going to demand for an extension? And that's what makes me fearful, is that they'll be promised more prisoner releases. They'll get even more concessions. I think in that case, they might agree to an extension if they can get something out of it for themselves. But then I think we have to ask, will we really be any closer to our objectives and our goals, which is, a genuine peace process and a split, Taliban split from al-Qaeda, because we haven't seen that either. So I think, the only realistic way forward is to try to keep the peace process going, but recalibrate it in a way that we refocus on reductions in violence, counterterrorism guarantees, Taliban splitting from al-Qaeda, the things that we need to see, and don't put conditions on our troops. I think that's been part of our problem in terms of, or put conditions, base our troop decisions on conditions on the ground, what's happening. Look at the reality of what's happening on the ground and base your troop decisions on that, not on some arbitrary timeline. Unfortunately, President Biden seems to be quite anxious, just like President Trump was, to withdraw all troops as soon as possible. But that doesn't help us get any closer to our real objective. So, hopefully people can prevail on the president and explain why it's important to at least keep a small presence there in Afghanistan to backstop the Afghan forces. Let's face it, we went from 12,000 troops to 3,500 within a year. We've essentially right-sized our presence. And I think if you ask most Americans, are you willing to foot a bill of $5 billion a year to prevent another major terrorist attack on US soil, they would agree to that. I think the politics have gotten very confused in the US. You don't see people on the streets demanding that the US pull all troops out of Afghanistan. It's not like a Vietnam type situation. You do have some fatigue, but if we can readjust our goals and strategy and understand that we still face terrorist threats, we still need a certain number of troops on the ground. There's no winning. There's no, completely finding a great, rosy solution, but we still have interests to protect. We have tools to do that. And it's just going to be, one of those issues that we have to manage. We may not be able to solve.
Jonathan,
I
come back to you.
I fully agree with Lisa. Look, it's no secret anymore. The main storyline has been, broken promises and broken commitments. I mean, the whole Doha agreement was essentially about withdrawal, and the Taliban have, on their part, essentially stuck to ensuring that the United States stick to their end of the bargain, no matter what the Taliban would do in return. And in their end, they haven't done enough, to say the least. Now, in fact, the Trump administration went so far as to drawing sort of a moral equivalence between the Taliban and critics in and outside the Afghan government, and then shortcut around that, deal with the Taliban came with an enormous cost. So, in my view, personal view, this U.S. proposal is no different. Unfortunately, as Lisa said, it has enormous price attached to it, and that price is not just entertaining these very dangerous ideas of replacing the current elected government with a non-elected one, perhaps one picked by a handful of clerics, but also the danger of conceding enormously to the Taliban in entertaining their added demands of releasing their remaining prisoners and relisting their leaders from various international sanction lists in exchange for 3 or 6 months of extension to the May 1 deadline. Now, for the Taliban, this is a win-win here, and by that I mean they're winning twice. But because the U.S. proposal is tied to May 1 withdrawal date, I would say that that the United States war, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, has essentially ended. So they should, basically go ahead and declare it.
Bill.
Yeah, following what Ambassador Jawed has just said, it's been a mystery to me from the outset why, if an American president wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, he wouldn't simply withdraw from Afghanistan rather than give all sorts of goodies to the Taliban on the way out, because there's no doubt that the way in which the process has been handled has had the effect of weakening the position of the Afghan government, boosting the credibility of the Taliban. A very strange kind of approach to take. If there is any Taliban agreement to an extension, I think it will be secretive rather than overt and public, because they have their own constituencies that they need to manage at the moment, including some fired up commanders in the ground who might be perturbed by the disappearance of the legitimating notion that the Taliban have been using since forever, to the effect that they're fighting against foreign forces and all foreign forces have to leave Afghanistan. It becomes quite difficult for the Taliban overtly, as opposed to covertly, to agree to a continuation of a troop presence. But there's one other element which also does come into play here, which is the European dimension. To the extent that President Biden is keen to repair relations with the NATO powers that have been certainly compromised at various points during the Trump presidency, he does need to be alert to some of the concerns of European players. And there's considerable concern amongst European governments at the moment that if the Taliban come back in Afghanistan, there will be a monumental outflow of refugees from Afghanistan in the direction of Europe rather than the United States, which could severely stress the agreement between Turkey and the Europeans to prevent further movement into Europe, and which could ultimately see very large numbers of Afghan refugees again finding their way to European countries. 200,000 people made their way from Afghanistan to Europe in 2015, and the numbers that might flow out of Afghanistan if the Taliban really come back and begin to behave the way in which they behaved in the 1990s could be vastly greater than that particular number. So Europe does have a very, very strong interest at the moment in what happens in Afghanistan, arguably a more potent interest than the United States has.
Bill, since you bring in external powers, I think we should explore whether the international community, and particularly the regional powers, really have any influence over the course of events. So much of the American strategy has been based on the fact that what you want to do is create a consensus among these players, and that they would be able to apply pressure on the Taliban and, for that matter, on the Kabul government. But do we have any influence that the Taliban or the Kabul government, in the end at least, is willing to bend to international pressure? Ahmed?
Well, I think, this is a really important question, and I think there was a critical loss of using the international community when the Americans decided to negotiate on their own with the Taliban instead of bringing in the United Nations or bringing in someone else. What you need right now to bring the regional countries together is a UN effort, or at least or some other a multilateral effort, not just the United States. That's the first point. And secondly, you really need to understand what pressure they can bring to bear. Well, in my opinion, the Taliban have been given passports. They've got free right to travel anywhere. We saw recently how they refused to answer questions about the interim government, and they were flying to China and Turkey and God knows where else. And so that could be stopped. I mean, until the Taliban get concessions. We know that this image of them having their freedom to move around the world, as it were, even though they still labeled as terrorists, according to the UN, the fact of the matter is that they need to be curtailed. And this would really hurt them if all the regional countries could come together and say, we will not allow you to land in our country unless you give us some timetable for and what kind of government you want, and answer some of our pressing questions. And I don't see, unfortunately, the Turkey meeting or any other meeting at the moment taking such a hard line with the Taliban. But a hard line is what is needed. And it does matter a great deal, because the Taliban have been especially proud of the fact that all these countries who are anti-Taliban, Iran, Russia, China, etc., are suddenly, dying to meet with Taliban leaders.
But excuse me, but Ahmed, they've been able to get the legitimacy, even despite the fact that they have not honored their agreements. Is maybe the message to them that these outside powers will give them what they want regardless, because ultimately it may have to deal with them as the de facto government, so that they're hedging here, that they may very well be having, as I say, to deal with a Taliban government, and therefore are not likely to really lay down the line to them. But Lisa.
Well,
okay,
I agree. It's very difficult, but I think this is the only major concession that the international community has, to put the pressure on the Taliban and stop their flying around.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more with Ahmed Rashid. And I think, yes, regional powers, having a role, having a meeting, a UN-sponsored meeting, again, not a bad idea, but what is going to be the goal? And I would agree with Ahmed that the goal should be to create leverage with the Taliban, that you're bringing the region together to prevail upon the Taliban, to engage in discussions on reductions in violence, ceasefire, all of these things that we don't see them doing now. So I think that's the important thing to keep at the top of our minds. How is this regional meeting, how is it going to facilitate a genuine peace process? Let's not just go into it sort of open-minded and let's have a strategy, a goal for how it can really move the peace talks forward. And I agree with Ahmed. The next step is to put more pressure on the Taliban, not give them more goodies, but use our leverage with them to get them to do things like split their relationships from international terrorists, reduce their violence, agree to a ceasefire. This should be what we're trying to do. And just one other point is I couldn't agree more on the need for the US to consult more closely with Europe. Unfortunately, I think the Europeans feel that they have not been consulted closely, that this 8-page peace plan and the ideas that were thrown out a few weeks ago were not coordinated. The US did not consult with their European partners, even though there's now more troops in Afghanistan from other countries than the US. So it really is imperative for us to work closely with the Europeans. They have the same concerns as us. They have the same values and strategies and goals. So it doesn't make sense if the US throws out there the idea that there should be this UN regional meeting, but doesn't involve the European countries or the EU. That makes no sense. You're bringing countries like Russia, China, even Pakistan, countries that don't necessarily have the same strategic goals as we do, but you're leaving out the countries that do share our goals and that provide tremendous amounts of assistance to Afghanistan. So I think there's just, it's mixed up. The way the US strategy's just kind of been thrown out there, like throwing Jello at a wall, rather than thinking through, okay, how are we going to get from point A to point B? What is our strategy? How are we going to draw on countries that share our interests? How are we going to, isolate or make sure that countries who would be spoilers cannot, promote their goals and interests. And here I'm thinking about Pakistan. And again, we need to think of ways to work with the European partners to have them also put pressure on Pakistan to use the full weight of its influence with the Taliban. Yes, they have played a semi-helpful role. They released Mullah Barater a few years ago. They have helped keep the talks on track when they were about to collapse, but they have not really made the Taliban uncomfortable in their sanctuary inside Pakistan. This has not changed. So I think these are the goals and strategies that we should be implying.
Ahmed, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, Lisa, I completely agree with you. And most important of all, in my opinion, and what the public in Pakistan wants is an end game for the Taliban to leave Pakistan. I mean, when are they going to go back to Afghanistan? Under what conditions? And that, frankly, I don't believe that issue has even been raised by Ambassador Khalilzad or by any of the other interlocutors as to what will Pakistan be doing with all these, with the entire Taliban leadership, which is actually based there. So, that is the kind of real pressure that can be put on them. Iran, the same. Taliban are sitting in Iran. They need to be pressured. But this can't just happen with one country doing the pressure. All the regional countries have to come together and assert their pressure.
Bill?
Yes, I very much agree with what Ahmed just said. And I do think the problem is a very long-standing one, that for quite a number of years now, there's been a disposition in some circles in Washington to see Pakistan as part of the solution rather than as part of the problem. And when one sort of goes down that pathway for a prolonged period of time, it then becomes difficult to execute the kind of pirouette that's required to take account of the fact that the sanctuaries are still critical to the military disruptions that the Taliban can execute within Afghanistan itself, and which are central to the role that it's playing at the moment. Of course, there are plenty of forms of leverage that the United States and its allies can bring to bear with respect to Pakistan. And Lisa actually did a paper some years ago which set out very methodically a whole range of measures that could be instrumentalized in order to signal to Pakistan that the continuation of these sanctuaries was an undesirable kind of development, but that's not the path which has been taken. I also wonder in that context, however, whether there's a particular policy-making problem for Washington at the moment, which is related to the role of Dr. Khalilzad himself, because it seems to me, watching from a distance, that he's somewhat in the position of somebody who has bought a fake Rembrandt and is the last person who's going to admit that he did so. And it's in a way comfortable for the Biden administration to let him stay on in that particular role, because it means that if the situation in Afghanistan really does turn to dust and ashes, there's a Republican left over from the Trump administration who can carry the blame for things going wrong. But that doesn't necessarily make for a good diplomatic environment, because Dr. Khalilzad is not trusted by the Afghan government. He's not feared by the Taliban. And that is a very undesirable mix of characteristics for somebody in this particular role.
Javed.
I fully agree with everything that's being said. We haven't seen much in measurable terms with respect to regional pressure on the Taliban. I think the Taliban are too comfortable, not just in Pakistan, but also in Doha. On the contrary, on the Afghan government side, there's been constant pressure exerted from all sides. And on our end, we have paid a price for peace, not because we wanted to, but because we wanted to be seen, and we wanted to engage in good faith in negotiations. I think the United States is losing leverage, arguably, like by the day, not just because it's constantly repeating that we're going to leave, but because until the Doha talks, as it continues, it used to be, the whole peace negotiations, even though it was repeated there was an Afghan-owned and Afghan-led process, but it was, effectively a US-led and US-facilitated peace process. But now, with the involvement of the United Nations, I think it's going to be a peace process. So the idea here is that the United States wants a solution that's just good enough. So there is an effort to engage the United Nations and essentially do some burden sharing. So after this, I suspect that the process will be known as a UN-led process, and in that regard, the US's leverage on the Taliban would be, somewhat essentially lessened. On Pakistan or regionally, I think Pakistan's role remains significant, but it also remains largely ambiguous and unclear. We still don't know, and we have no idea what the Pakistanis are doing. Unfortunately, with Pakistan, we, as Afghans at the government level, we haven't reached a common definition of peace, stability, or even common definition of what terrorism is. Now, their definition is that Pakistan's enemy should be our enemy, but not the other way around. And so I think the approach that I have seen, at least if I put my analytical hat, I think the Pakistanis as a state level, they treat Afghanistan as a half state. And this is not in the spirit of good neighborly relationship. So any deal that may or may not come out of Turkey now needs to have, in my mind, verifiable political guarantees from Pakistan. Otherwise, it will be destined to fail.
Presumably, whatever this process is, it's not going to be solved by anything before the 1st of May. It's going to go on for some time. If, however, the Taliban do not accept the extension that the US is proposing and begins targeting American assets, our allies in Afghanistan, does this effectively blow up the process? Have we put enough emphasis on the fact that what really matters here, as far as the United States' role, is its air power, its ability to inject into the conflict the kind of action that the Taliban most fear, which prevents, presumably, any congregation of forces which would inevitably be necessary in order to take over provincial capitals and Kabul itself. So what are we looking at now, assuming now that the US is not going to be leaving on the 1st of May? Is the Taliban, are they going to simply say, well, that's it, it's over? And now can we expect anything out of any Doha meetings that would follow the Turkish the Turkish meeting? So what's your thoughts on this? Realistically, what are we looking at in the next few weeks?
Well, again, to kick off the discussion, I think much would depend upon whether the Taliban indeed embarked on major military activities on the 1st of May directed against the residual US presence within Afghanistan, although it's much easier for them to target Afghan military and civilian targets than it is for them to strike at the United States' forces just at the moment. If they were to do so on a large scale, I think it would probably mark the end of the process as it has existed up to this particular point. Because to be realistic, the Taliban have not shown any particular interest in negotiating with the Afghan government. They went through the motions, but essentially the Doha agreement gave them everything they really wanted. The status of a place at the table with the United States, the release of 5,000 prisoners, and a timeline for the withdrawal of US forces. If that unravels from their point of view, they'll then make choices about what to do, but it certainly has not incentivized them to negotiate in good faith with the Afghan government. My understanding is that although there have been some working group meetings, there hasn't been a full plenary meeting in Doha between the Taliban delegation and the Afghan delegation for months. And that's pretty well exactly what I would have expected, that the Taliban would engage in strategic stalling at that point, because they were never particularly interested in negotiating with the Afghan government, but simply harvesting the benefits of what already had been promised to them by the Trump administration in the Doha agreement. And of course, there was nothing in that agreement which required that intra-Afghan negotiations be conducted in good faith.
Yeah, other thoughts on this?
Yeah, Marv, I think you raised a good point that the U.S. Still has capabilities in Afghanistan, even though we've drawn down forces considerably over the last year. If we do keep troops beyond May 1st, which is looking increasingly likely, but if the Taliban decide to, try to resume attacks on the United States, we are not sitting ducks. We have capabilities. We can respond. We've got the air power that you talked about. So I think that, there are ways to respond if the Taliban decide they're going to resume attacks on U.S. forces. And again, I think the narrative is important here. The Taliban keeps saying that the U.S., if the U.S. stays past May 1st, it's the U.S. that's not living up to the agreement. But that's just not true. The Taliban have not broken ties with al-Qaeda. We know al-Qaeda is still training in Taliban-held areas. They've not reduced the violence. In fact, they increased targeted killings against Afghan civil society leaders. So again, I think that, there's ample reason to say, the Taliban have not lived up to their role in the peace agreement. And therefore, the U.S. needs to keep troops there. We want to keep the peace process going. We want to try to find a way to make these peace talks work. But it's not happening. And it's not reality to admit that the peace process has not taken effect as the U.S. expected it would have by now.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lisa, I thoroughly agree. I think the US still has leverage, despite having kind of dribbled its way through all the leverage that it had a year ago at the beginning. But most importantly, I think what the US has is leverage. It has air power, and it has this whole issue of the Taliban as a terrorist group and the listing of the UN and all that diplomatic finesse. And the Taliban want that to go. And that's going to be their next demand. That will be their demand in Turkey, that we want to be taken off this list, and we're an acknowledged political group, etc., and we want to fly around the world. So I think that leverage should not be frittered away by the US. It should be, it can be given if there is really some substantial momentum from the Taliban, and that means most importantly, give us your game plan. What kind of government do you want? What kind of government do you want which would be acceptable to the Afghan public at large? Remember, the Taliban, whether they are, of course, in the military ascendance, but they are a minority as far as Afghanistan is concerned. There is still a majority of the population that wants a proper system of governance, that don't want a couple of mullahs leading the way. So I think that's really, the US has to think very carefully as to not giving away this leverage that it has.
Panelists, Abid, Javed, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think there are a lot of moving pieces, but I'll just point to three. One is that a lot also depends on whether or not the Taliban would declare their spring offensive. Even if they don't declare it openly, they could still engage in an undeclared way, just like they have been doing for a while. But it will also depend on the scale of their attacks, mainly in urban settings, but also the frequency of those attacks and the number of casualties it could inflict, including on part of the US and our NATO partners. That's first. And the second is that we also have to wait and see what happens in Turkey and whether there will be any kind of a reduction in violence, but or some sort of a ceasefire agreement at the end of that conference. But and whether or not that the Taliban would actually stick to it, I can predict at least 3 scenarios around Taliban's engagement in the Turkey conference as they go. I think first would be that they could well go to the conference and say that they want their conditions met in advance of agreeing to anything, including discussing a ceasefire or a political roadmap. And those conditions would be, of course, the prisoners' release or delisting of their leaders. So in this case, the United States would then go on to pressure the Afghan government, but the government would want to resist and maybe calling for some kind of a loya jirga to decide. The second could be that the Taliban would come into the conference and they would agree to the US proposal, but only on the condition that first the current government, the Afghan government, would need to step down. And only after that, the Taliban would agree to assemble and maybe possibly self-appoint impartial clerical or non-clerical elements to form an interim government, which the Taliban may or may not be part of. And then the third would be the Taliban comes in and then they, outrightly rejects the U.S. proposal, and then essentially, push to go back to the Doha process. But they would provide a temporary extension to the May 1 deadline in exchange for certain concessions. Again, maybe no airstrikes, some prisoner release, and some delisting.
We're hearing that the negotiations that are going on with the Taliban now are focused as much as anything on just getting the Taliban to say they're prepared to reduce violence. Of course, it raises the question about why we should take their word for it, even if they agree to this. And in the end, if this is really in the eye of the beholder, as much as anything else. Let me complete our discussion here with what is a basic issue. So much of what we have seen in this lengthy process of negotiation with the Taliban has been premised on the idea that the Taliban are honestly prepared for some kind of power sharing. And the question is just what form it should take. Are we wrongly thinking about this? Should we really be willing to accept the idea that the Taliban are willing to be in a position of perhaps even being junior partners in some kind of government? Or should we take them at their word that what they want is a Islamic State as they define that? And if you combine that ideological view together with the fact that militarily they're sitting as powerfully as they are we perhaps simply fooling ourselves into thinking that, in fact, a sustainable, enforceable peace with the Afghan, with the Taliban, is in fact possible, which would make so much of what has been the activity over the last months and now into years seem as if it's beside the point? Thinking on this, Bill.
I have thought for at least 15 years that the notion of a power sharing agreement with the Taliban was a mirage. The Taliban have not at any stage in their history been power sharers, and there are very bad historical records all over the place of attempts to run power sharing agreements with players that are not interested in sharing power that have come unstuck in the implementation phase, whether we go back to the salami tactics that were used by East European communists in the late 1940s, or whether we look at the role of Hun Sen in taking over from Prince Ranariddh in Cambodia or whatever. When you have players that are separated not just by conflicts of interest, but by profound conflicts of values and vision, it becomes very, very difficult to put power sharing arrangements in place. And that becomes even more complicated when you have profound levels of distrust between the parties, such as exist in Afghanistan at the moment. And it's a nice thought that you could actually produce a political settlement that would produce stability in Afghanistan. But it seemed to me for a very long period of time that the fundamentals are actually not there for that kind of agreement to take place, that you might be able over a very long period of time to build from the grassroots up some workable arrangements, in particular Woolworths or places like that, for different forces to work together. But when you're talking about large political agreements, particularly when you have outside sponsors for different players that have geopolitical interests of their own, it's really wishful thinking to think that you're going to get a negotiated agreement that is going to stick, rather than one that will turn into another Arusha Accords with disaster flowing from it.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say we should.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I think we should judge the Taliban on their actions. And if they show no willingness to reduce violence, or, eventually show that they will engage in a ceasefire, then maybe it is time to reassess whether a peace process is even possible. Because it makes no sense to have a sort of pretend peace process that maybe is only serving to strengthen their hand. So I think we should, keep pressing, but again, recognizing that if the Taliban don't show any interest in making any concessions at all, then we're going to have to, give up and focus on a new strategy. And just to address something that Ambassador Malley had said before about a paper that I wrote with many experts, Marv, you were included in that paper as well, that was released, I believe, in the beginning of 2017, about 4 years ago. And we called for a series of steps to try to convince Pakistan to change its policies toward the Taliban. And the Trump administration did implement part of that. The Trump administration suspended all security assistance to Pakistan in January 2018. That was something that a lot of people had argued would cause the US-Pakistan relationship to blow up. They would close down the ground lines of communication, air lines of communication. Of course, that didn't happen. So I think, in a way, we showed that you can take steps and you're not necessarily going to see Pakistanis overreact. But at the same time, it did not sort of fundamentally change Pakistani calculus toward the Taliban. I will admit to that. So that we need to focus on that and figure out, how we can adjust that calculus. I think you're beginning to see initial recognition on the damage that supporting militancy as a foreign policy tool has caused to the Pakistani economy, and Pakistan's ability to sort of continue to rise and keep up with neighbors, not only India, but Bangladesh. Pakistan's fallen behind Bangladesh on key social and economic indicators. So you see the beginning of recognition of that, but you haven't sort of seen that full shift within the Pakistani leadership. And that's something we need to keep working on and chipping away at. But I guess my main point here is that we should judge the peace process on what each of the actors do. And to do that, you need a neutral person that is conducting these negotiations and that is expecting compromises from both sides. That is the definition of a peace process.
But if you don't believe that the Taliban, rather that, the Taliban are really prepared to make concessions, if they're willing, that they're not really prepared for a transactional kind of relationship, then it seems to me that what you're left with here is something that Bill was alluding to from the bottom up, and that is a process of reintegration rather than reconciliation in the larger sense. And that it means that if this does fall apart, the international community and the United States has to be part of that, has to be willing to say, well, what now? How now can we preserve the kind of Afghanistan that is going to be of to the interest of all of us, really? Because there seems to be a broad consensus here, consensus that a Taliban-dominated regime with its likely allies is going to pose security issues for the region and ultimately globally. Last thoughts, Ahmed, Javed?
Well, like on the Taliban, I would say, yeah, you know, sometimes they say that you have to see it to believe it, but I think sometimes you have to believe in something for it to be seen. I don't think the Taliban have changed, you know, and of course change is very subjective, but we haven't seen anything from them. I think they still have not come to terms with what they really, really want. We keep talking about an intra-Afghan consensus, but no one talks about an intra-Taliban consensus because there is none. Now, the Taliban are conducting the talks on their own terms. They're also fighting on their own terms. I suspect, and I would posit that they would also want to have a power sharing arrangement on their own terms. Now, the problem is Taliban's objective since 1996 hasn't really changed, and that is to take over the Afghan system and fundamentally change it. So in this case, they're quite uncompromising. They're very stubborn. They're intransigent. They haven't conceded. Their codependent relationship with all kinds of militant groups and terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, remains intact. They haven't socialized peace. Their public and private messaging remains principally based on this sort of victory narrative. So it's hard. So it's hard to predict what they would do or what they would not do, particularly as we go into Turkey. Now, as an alternative, one other possibility is to go with essentially, or at least consider President Ghani's plan for peace. Not sure if you've seen that one pager with 3 bridges that was recently leaked, but it had 3 elements that said, making peace, building peace, and sustaining peace. Now, assume, for example, that we follow that plan and we emerge in the Turkey conference with an agreement with the Taliban on a political end state. And so the period between the agreement reached in Turkey and until the time there is elections, for example, that period will naturally be a transitional period. Let's say that could, take anywhere between 6 to 18 months. You could call this period a peace government, for example, where there will be certain things that would be off limits. For example, the president, his deputies, perhaps both upper and lower houses of the parliament, and even, or definitely the Afghan security forces will remain intact in that plan and they cannot be replaced. Everything else, including the Afghan cabinet, the Afghan bureaucracy, they can be changed. So that is, potentially like one of the plans that could be looked into as a possibility for a longer term arrangement between the 2 sides. But the problem is, if we go to Turkey and we face deadlock, mainly because of the Taliban, I think it would also be very, very important for the United States to provide 2 very clear messages. One would be that the Taliban do not want peace, and it has to be, that message needs to be reinforced by the regional partners or actors as well. And the second one would be that in the event of a U.S. withdrawal, where U.S.'s presence goes down to 0 troops, the U.S. would need to commit openly and publicly that they would support the Afghan security forces, say, for the next 5 years, without accepting any kind of a transitional setup.
Ahmed, you have quickly the last word.
No, if there's any extension, I don't think the Americans should offer any kind of timeline. If they agree to extend their presence, they shouldn't say it's for 3 months, 6 months, whatever. They should just extend their presence for the time being. And I think the bottom line is that the if the Taliban do not come up with a game plan for political settlement, they do not come up with a roadmap, then I think, all bets are off. And, as Ambassador Ahmed is saying, that there is then very little scope for dialogue. So the Taliban have to come up with a game plan. And the international community has to come up with something more assertive than just saying we will not interfere in Afghanistan, some platitude like that. We want the international community to play a role, the neighbors to play a role, to accept the fact that this is a last attempt, and the alternative is war, civil war. What is needed is for the regional countries to say, we will not allow the Taliban to move around unless they come to a settlement.
Thank you. Let's now use the remaining time to field some questions from our viewers. One here, isn't it a condition-based approach to peace process really in effect breaking the Doha agreement, and can't we expect the Taliban will respond militarily? Well, perhaps we have largely answered this question, but do we have anything more that we want to add to that, what we've said already? Well, let me go on with another question then. Is Khalilzad, the questioner asks, the wrong person to be leading the peace process? As I look at these questions, so many of them I think that we really have addressed over this past hour. But anything more about Khalilzad? Perhaps not. I
think Ambassador Maley, didn't you address this earlier?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
I did.
I think so. I'm looking at the questions here, and they're very good. But I think it speaks to the fact that we have had such a comprehensive discussion, that we have covered so many of them.
Could I make one comment about Khalilzad's role, assuming that he's the author of the 8-page document that has been put into the public domain? There are some things which, as a non-American, strike me as quite astounding in that particular document. One was the colonial kind of tone to it, really, that a group of foreigners could come in when there's a constitution that's been in place since 2004 and just sort of shove it aside. And it reminds me of the story that came about in the late 1970s when someone said to President Somoza of Nicaragua, would you resign if President Carter asked you to? And he said, of course, as long as President Carter will resign if I ask him to. Right, going back to Doha, there's been a real problem about the ambiguous attitude of Khalilzad and his team to the notion of state sovereignty, excluding the Afghan government from the negotiations, but perhaps more seriously, committing the allies to withdraw at the same time as the United States, a commitment which, as far as I can gather, was made without explicit authorization from allied states to be made, certainly where my country is concerned. This is actually not a good thing in the long run, and to me, it starts having echoes of the way in which Henry Cabot Lodge positioned himself as the US ambassador to South Vietnam before the overthrow of President Diem on the 1st of November 1963. And that's not a happy precedent. People have used the expression slow motion coup to describe what the current proposals are putting forward for Afghanistan. And it's worth remembering that if you destabilize an existing constitutional framework, imperfect though it may be, the danger is that you will create an anarchic situation in which everything spins out of your control, and suddenly you're confronted with a whole range of consequences which you didn't anticipate. There are certainly some Afghan political actors at the moment who are licking their lips at the sight of the interim government proposals because they see it as a way of getting rid of a president whom they don't particularly like. But it would pay them to think very carefully about whether what then results is going to be something that they find congenial, or whether the only victors from that kind of political manipulation would end up being the Taliban. That's one reason I think that a new American envoy who's more attuned to the considerations of sovereignty that actually come into play in these kind of relationships would not be a bad idea. And of course, if the United Nations comes to play a more direct role in any of these kind of processes, it will have to recognize the implications of the Afghan government representing a sovereign state and the Taliban not doing so.
Can I just add something there? Because I think this is important. This 8-page peace plan doesn't really address realistically what happens to the Afghan security forces. If, you know, their legitimacy comes from the Afghan state, right? So what happens to the Afghan security forces? And, you know, these are security forces that we have been fighting and dying with for the last 20 years. You know, we have relied on the Afghan security forces to help us in counterterrorism missions. They've conducted several operations in the last couple of years, taking down very senior al-Qaeda leaders. You know, we're not going to be able to rely on the Taliban to help us with these counterterrorism missions. So there's a big question mark there. If you are so easily removing the Afghan state, you know, what happens to the security forces, which, you know, are legitimized by the state? And then the second point that I would make is I share Ambassador Malley's concerns that some power-hungry Afghan leaders are being short-sighted, and they may view an interim arrangement as a short-term way for them to gain power, but they're losing sight of the longer-term costs that the Taliban would use an interim arrangement to further their own grip on the country. And once that happens, all Afghan leaders that have participated in the democratic process over the last 20 years would be simply pushed out of the way. So it's amazing to me that these Afghan leaders don't see through the Taliban game. Unfortunately, I think that the prospect of power is simply blinding them.
One could also argue it's the fact that seeing no other way to end this conflict, these actors, as you're talking about, are desperate for just about any possibility and keep alive a fiction that should have been, I think, addressed earlier on. I have a question. During the negotiations on an interim, is this likely to expose fissures within both the Afghan Republic side as well as the Taliban? That is, can these negotiations themselves be divisive in that they expose the differences that exist within these on both sides, within these interlocutors? Thought on this?
Yes, I think that's happening already. As Lisa's comments made very clear, there are people who are grasping what they see as opportunities to reposition themselves politically within the Afghan political space. I think there's a greater danger, though, however, which flows from the same source, which is that when proposals like this are injected into the space, it's not just Afghan political actors who hear about them. It's a whole range of civil society elements in Afghanistan, power holders in different parts of the country. The free media in Afghanistan mean that everyone's talking about this at the moment. And the danger is that that can then have an impact on mass psychology, that when regimes change in Afghanistan, it's not typically because one power grinds its way to the center of Kabul. It's because political actors who don't want to be on the losing side and who are watching all the time to see from which direction the wind is blowing, recalculate what might be in their prudential interest to do, even if they don't particularly like the Taliban. And that, I think, is one of the greatest problems associated with the entire diplomatic process, that the signal that has been sent more broadly into Afghanistan is that the United States is simply looking for any way out that it can find. And the danger then is that will trigger some kind of cascade where people will realign themselves. We only have to go back to 1992 when the UN tried to finesse a regime change in Afghanistan, and instead a cascade resulted, to see what kind of problems can flow from that. It's a great mistake to think that peace proposals will roll out neatly in the way in which the architects of those proposals planned. There's not a single peace plan for Afghanistan, the Geneva Accords, the 1992 proposals, whatever, that has ever worked out exactly the way in which the architects had anticipated. And what's actually very important is this kind of situation, when you have new ideas being injected into the realm of discussion, is to think, how might things go wrong as a result of the floating of this particular proposal? And what measures do we need to take to guard against disaster flowing as an unintended consequence of some kind of initiative that we've taken?
You know, history has demonstrated over the past several decades that at no point have the Taliban themselves been able to solve their own problems. There's no, I think, example here of where the Taliban negotiating with one another have led to a cessation of hostilities. It's only been when outside parties intervened. So is the very notion of Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace in a way unrealistic, in that history does not bear out this kind of outcome, and that ultimately, without a greater involvement here of the international community and acting in its own interests, in the sense that very few in the international community here would welcome a Taliban regime. Should we now be focused much more on international involvement in this, in a different sense here, and that is a way called a post-negotiation approach here for what is our plan B? And let's we may have to conclude with that question.
I think plan B should be to allow, give the UN a chance. I mean, remember, anything that has happened in Afghanistan successfully has been with UN leadership supported enormously by the international community and the regional countries. Now, can you create that kind of pressure once again that you had at the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan with Diego Cordovez there, or with the Bonn meeting and with the defeat of the Taliban? Can you create that momentum again? And obviously we know that the world is much more fragmented now. I mean, for the Americans, the Russians to sit on one at one table and agree is going to be a very difficult task. But we are left with no other choices. I mean, I don't think it's going to be sufficient for the Americans to continue this process. And I think what is needed is much greater international and regional involvement, hopefully through the UN.
Anything else on this? What is the UN's record here? Is the UN a trusted intermediary?
Well, well, at one level, the UN has had a continuous presence through the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan over a very long period of time, which is not trivial. And there are people within the UN system who are very well informed about the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. Very much would depend upon what kind of mandate the Security Council would be prepared to give to UN officials who might be tasked with trying to bring to bear creative approaches to addressing a complex situation such as that in Afghanistan. And I think there are two different pressures at work here. One is the pressure to solve something which is a humanitarian problem as well as just a political problem. That's not a trivial pressure. The other pressure, however, is that the UN has had bad experiences over the years of having extremely difficult problems given to it to manage, and then finding itself under-resourced to both politically and materially to deal with the situation that confronts it. And that was one of the factors that led the Brahimi report 20 years ago to highlight that the UN shouldn't be taking on missions if it was not going to be adequately resourced to undertake what was required to carry a mission through to fruition. So a lot would need to be put in place to ensure that not only would there be an appropriate mandate for the UN to be involved, but there would be appropriate resourcing for UN activities that might flow from that particular mandate.
Finally, in all of our discussion, we've really not addressed the fact that so much has been spoken without really taking into account the Afghan people themselves and what they want, what they will accept. And it's perhaps a fault that we all share here, that we have been thinking about formulae which may or may not work. We've been addressing it from an elite to elite standpoint and have not really a good sense here about the Afghans themselves, and whether in fact over these 20 years we have not created a human capital in Afghanistan here, people whose investment in this country is such that if things go badly, there certainly will be the first among those refugees. So I think there's a strong argument to be made here for we've got to take more concern as we look for ways forward which reflect what the Afghan people themselves are willing to accept. But even then, to recognize that we probably cannot in any way satisfy all of them. But there is conceivably here enough of a commonality of view that I think that we do bear some responsibility to understand that, and that we cannot think simply of providing solutions for them that they themselves are not party to. So with that, I want to thank our panelists and our viewing audience here. I think what we've had from the panel here has been a far-reaching and yet incisive discussion, which I hope goes to our being able to get a better grasp here about what's happening on the moment, but also where this process seems to be going. We've raised some of the large issues, and we've also looked in some detail at many of the smaller issues that are involved. So again, thank you for joining us, and let's hope that we can have panels like this in the future and be more optimistic than this panel has been, unfortunately, about what the future bears.